Hello everyone. Today I would like to talk about rural and private churches in high medieval Europe. Um, this is a topic that I'm not really an expert on, but I think it's extremely fascinating in many ways because we will be seeing how much rural churches were actually instrumental to to certain local policies carried out not just by the clergy but also and especially from a certain time onwards in Europe by the secular powers. So, giving a bit of context, we can say that the foundation of local churches is something extremely ancient in the Middle Ages, and it happened basically as soon as talking about the Romano-Germanic kingdoms, as soon as these Germans arrived and converted to Catholicism. But even if they were still Arian, sometimes this happened, and eventually these churches, were simply reconverted. We're talking about the buildings as such, not, the single, thoughts that were expressed there. And we're talking about an foundation of churches that really took place mostly in the countryside, spreading in areas like this that, originally speaking, hadn't really been really the target of Christianization, in the sense that, as you know, Christianity spreads throughout the arteries and veins of the Roman Empire that were the bigger connections that had as central points the cities, and Christianity spreads mostly into the cities, and the dioceses were mostly founded into cities in post-Roman Europe, um, and it was from these centers that basically the process of Christianization of the countryside started. And the reason why this happened was obviously that the city was a strategical, um, a very important strategical center in many ways, because the elites meant as the nobility, and in this sense also the cultural elites were there. The rulers ruled from cities at that time in the world, in the Roman world or even Romano-Germanic world. So seizing the city as a base for the expansion of Christianity had been the first objective of the Christians. And the countryside had remained usually in the first centuries of Christianity itself largely untouched by Christianization. In most Roman Europe, the people of Christian Roman Europe, because obviously the empire converts at a certain point to Christianity officially, had remained well into the early Middle Ages pagan, practically. And this wasn't just a matter of faith or belief. It was a matter of social structures in many ways. The countryside in Europe had functioned largely since the Bronze Age in similar ways, and there were certain local beliefs that were actually quite deeply rooted and were connected with the agrarian cycles. So, as many of you know, Christianization of the countryside was a very long and complex process that mainly aimed into which the Christians couldn't enter, directly or violently. That happened in certain cases when especially they were backed by the local public authority. Think about the Saxons, with Charlemagne, Charles the Great. I don't know how you want to call him. But the rest of, the bigger picture of the Christianization of the countryside was something extremely progressive, usually even peaceful, because this progressivity actually didn't didn't require, very, very wall against wall attitudes. Um, and it was largely a process of substitution and of transformations of the same pagan beliefs and roots, and even of the actual shrines, into Christian ones. So this happened largely during the early Middle Ages, so in times in which the Roman Empire in the West didn't exist anymore, and into which the process of evangelization was carried out jointly with Romano-Germanic rule and political expansion. And this happened at many levels of Romano-Germanic society, because the building of new churches in the countryside, normally these small parishes and chapels and other shrines, were were essentially most of the times founded by either the aristocracy, but even by kings sometimes. So it was something that, as you understood from the social level, really entailed a bigger, process of political development, and it wasn't just something spontaneous on a local base. As we've seen, the local base wasn't even really much interested in changing its lifestyle. Christianization was in many cases very superficial, and it remained so for centuries, even for a millennium indeed, because large parts of Europe weren't Christianized even in the late Middle Ages, but or at least they had a very superficial degree of Christianization. And when you find a noble or a king building up a parish, you can't just see, a normal extension of the ecclesiastical, territorial organization organisms, but something much deeper that has to be understood in the light of the broadly political and socio-economical needs of those societies. So, um, um, the what happened at this point is that the local bishops sometimes didn't even build so many parishes around the country compared to secular powers. This might seem strange. It's not a rule. I don't want to extremize this. Obviously, there were areas in which bishops were more active than privates and secular powers. But let's say that the nobility that founded, parishes and rural churches were usually wealthier. I can't say wealthier than the bishop, because the bishops normally were part of this same aristocracy in many ways. So we can even spot a kind of parallel events. But let's say that the church during the early Middle Age and then in the High Middle Ages begins to structure itself always as something increasingly autonomous from the political powers. Not so jarringly, not so extremely at the beginning, but definitely with Gregorian reform a lot changed, and already by that time there were certain clergymen who had reached such a great power that they would feel in some ways, even in opposition in the broad political and social system um, of the place, as a sort of competitor of secular power. You also have to consider that in this context there was an originary attrition between the nobility of Germanic identity or tradition and the pre-existing Roman or Romanized local populations, meaning that especially in places like Italy or Gaul, where there had been a very early Christianization during Roman times, when the Germans arrived with their own traditions, etc., with their own ethos, warlike ethos, was against the pacifism in certain ways of the Christians. Um, there was a kind of clash between, I can say between cultures because it would be an exaggeration, but there were, let's say, there was a competition in the terms of local organization of the communities, etc. That obviously was seen as a good mean of uh, augmentation of political prestige, both by the lay aristocracies and the local clergymen. Um, Sometimes we know stories about local counts or dukes of Germanic origin that were quite proud about their identity, that they had this kind of warlike, violent mind that um, that tended to mess up a little certain situations, especially relatively to the serfs, meaning that the serfs were not freemen at that time, but the clergy in the church said, but these are still Christians and they should have all the same rights, at least for marrying, etc. The nobles kind of had a lordship over these people, and they didn't want maybe to marry because otherwise the girls would have left for going on another lord's land. All these problems that happened at that time. So sometimes from the contemporary sources we read that there are mostly ecclesiastical. We read episodes of extreme violence and brutality carried out by the lay aristocracies of Germanic tradition, in comparison to, and in opposition to the pious beliefs and behaviors of the priests and of the bishops. And that's a bit biased as a source, obviously, as a type of source, but there were and it basically hides contrasts that really went not always, but very often much beyond a cultural problem. It was mostly about actual power over the local communities. Um, I'm just saying this because these were things that really happened at that time, so we don't have to imagine, a perfectly synergic thought to make everything go well, but or a clash between pagan Germans and Roman Christians. It was nothing like that. People between each other kind of interacted properly, but there were obviously divisions. There were divisions, as a matter of fact, even within the same clergyman, because maybe a bishop owned certain rights over a diocese, and then maybe certain communities from another diocese would expand into their territories, founding churches, or maybe taking tithes from there, and you have to think all this mixed with local political up and downs and transformations. So something that really had more to do, really, for what we can understand historically speaking, with actual economic interests that were obviously important because the church had to live in some way and organize its properties, etc. But that sometimes, go beyond the same, strictly religious problem. And it's not a surprise that at this point, during the early and high Middle Ages, certain, you know, clergymen become extremely powerful on their own. Especially in places like Gaul. Gaul is a very beautiful example because in those regions, especially in the south, during the Merovingian times, local aristocracies were extremely important. Most of these aristocracies were actually embodied in the cities by bishops. So it was bishops that sometimes de facto ruled um, the local communities um, over a very weak or even non-existent secular power. Um, so relatively to this, you know, there is to say there was a competition, obviously, between the lay aristocracy and the clergy, because when a nobleman and not a bishop founded a rural church, a rural chapel, it could be even something very small. We're talking here about the early Middle Ages, so we're talking about poor cultures, poor communities. There weren't many resources, but at the same time, exactly for this reason, it's important to see that there were still foundations of churches, and now we will be seeing why, what profits such a thing would bring. Um, because when a nobleman founded a church, it was evident that this holy building, um, if built over, for instance, an allodial property of the lord of the nobleman, would mean that the goods coming from the endowment and the revenues coming from the endowment of the same church would go to the founding family, noble family, and this family would also get the protection over the newly founded church, and basically integrating in its own seigneurial property and assets, broadly speaking. So it was really a private church in many ways. And at this point, obviously, a church need also a priest, and where would be a priest taken from in these conditions? So it was a private foundation. The bishop had nothing to do with that, so the local church had nothing to do with that. Um, so into this shrine, the new priests would be placed from the kind of familiars of the founders. So the so-called family in Latin of the Lord were these people living, let's say, a close contact. It could be there could be serfs or other, affiliated people like clients, etc. That would be normally, very, um, um, very summarily educated, and then presented to the local bishop at this point to to obtain the formal consecration as priests. So at this point, obviously, it's meaningful that this consecration obviously had to pass from the ecclesiastical hierarchy, because at that point the bishop could say, well, but I don't like this guy. Let's suppose that this bishop had um, you know problems with the noble who had founded the local church in his own domain, and wanted to refuse that that a priest would be consecrated to officiate in that church. Well, he could deny, technically speaking. So you can understand how many potential for conflict this could bring sometimes within the same communities. However, going back to the nobleman, once that he had founded this nice small church in his own allodial domains, he would obviously keep controlling through this loyal, mm, you know, mm, person of his that he had made consecrated as priest, the same economical management of the church. Um, and and this means that that the original some first of all, let's consider this, that originally speaking, these churches would be built in fact as very small things, but it was extremely important in the early Middle Ages to make donations to church. And when you make a church in a place and there are people living around, this church becomes a very important gathering point for the community. So people will start to donate, and what would happen is that the church's endowment would be enlarged by other properties through donation. And we're talking obviously about poor economies that often, could give a very few. But over the centuries, this built up around the church a substantial quantity of properties. For instance, it was normal to give land to churches. It was normal of I studied certain sources from Longobard, Italy, for instance, and it was quite a common practice to donate maybe a very modest piece of land in your testament to the local church, just for an act of piety in many ways. It's moving sometimes to see how present in these people's mind would be the idea that by making a gift to the church, the heaven could be closer in some measure. And it's something that however is yeah, these were usually modest foundations, that were larger foundations, like larger donations, sorry, given by the kings, by the noblemen. So it was something pretty consistent that could create immediately a very large quantity of land around these these churches. Sometimes it was immediate. You found a church and you endow it with a very big amount of land. This happened quite often, and kept happening. The more European society grew in the High Middle Ages, and the more it was actually taking place. But even through small donations, local parishes, these small rural churches could actually grow to become something larger. And also, as it's always the case when talking about the Middle Ages, we don't have to think as to a strict territorial continuity into this. Obviously, the people who were more attached to the local church were the people who frequented it. So usually people who lived nearby, who had um, properties and other goods that could be, usually that were close to the church itself. But it happened often, especially in the more dynamic, economically dynamic regions of early medieval Europe, that certain donations could contain territories that were actually quite far from the church. The word churches maybe had properties at 70 kilometers distance. And you understand that well, obviously the local priests who managed the church, as we've seen, if it was of private foundation, the local aristocrat that had founded that, would try to, at that point, they could say, well, I don't have the means to reach that place 70 kilometers of distance. I simply sell it to someone and get the money. But it could be that, especially in the larger foundations, um, the the expansion of the church's property could actually reach a very large size, territorially speaking, and even expanding geographically into other areas, and to make a lordship on its own, because this is what in parallel the same lay aristocracies were doing. So you can understand in this sense from a small rural parish served by a very modest person, like you can imagine, the average parish of the early medieval Europe, surely a not highly educated or wealthy person. Well, it could grow to the point of even forming powerful ecclesiastical lordships that needed a very big quantity of resources even to administrate the whole thing. That means that you need local administrators, and you have to pay them, and this implies in turn that you know how to write. You have to know how to write, how to to deal with legal problems, to manage money. So all things that in a certain sense build up civilization. And this is also true, a channel through which this practically occurred. And we have also to think that many foundations weren't really originally tied with the local ecclesiastical administration, meaning that we made the example of the famulus of the Lord, who is brought in front of the local bishop and consecrated as a priest. But it could happen sometimes that the local, these foundations would be quite autonomous and even detached from the rest of the ecclesiastical structure. And they would acquire parochial rights only in a secondary moment. And the parochial rights, most of all, implied the 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 ability to cash tithes, because obviously the local ecclesiastical administrations, even at the parochial level, that was the smallest one, territorially speaking, um, um, would imply that local resources, local communities of believers had to pay to maintain that church, and tithes could become very meaningful, especially in those areas that were more populated, and therefore in those conditions in which the local church provided service for a greater amount of people. And you can imagine even the competition in this sense between the local, even the local priests, but also by through the local priests of the secular lords who had created originally the private foundation, and was basically behind that priest and managing the the church's property in that local on that local level. And to stress you know the degree of possession, the possessive mind and attitude of lords over these foundations of their own. It's interesting to recall the term that appears sometimes in Latin sources, that is the one of proprie, ecclesiae proprie, which basically means our own, your own churches. So something that really belonged to someone personally. And this can make you understand a lot about the mentality of those times. We're talking about, especially in certain areas of Europe, um, during the early and especially in the High Middle Ages, in which the concept of public authority was quite weak. Think, for instance, within the Franks. This happened most of the times in Northern Europe, in those areas in which there had been no state, in which the Roman tradition was weaker, in which the political structures were less centralized, and into which a kind of of warrior ethics had remained, for which it was all about the individual prestige, the individual possession that was something earned most of the times through fight. So something that was deserved, not in a Christian, um, fashion. Or at least, yeah, they could believe that God had granted them maybe victory and rights over a certain land, but it was mostly something stemming from a pagan, a warlike pagan background. So even the idea of founding a church and thinking that it's your own, it's your own as part of a family, as of a clan, etc., not of the local, um, pre-existing ecclesiastical administration represented by bishops, maybe of Roman origin that were not of Germanic origin, and that kind of reasoned as if they were still in the empire, at least now a Christian empire, and a sort of ecclesiastical empire that made the interests of the church and not of the local rulers. But as we said already before, there were also a lot of commixtions um, of bishops that incidentally were from the same local aristocracy, etc. You have to basically to check every single context to to understand how the local political game was actually played between aristocracies and church. And sometimes these foundations weren't really just about a single church, a single parish, with a single priest and maybe by another clergyman that helped him. But sometimes we're also talking about monastic or canonical churches, so something larger, something usually even in fact founded by the highest nobility, and if not by the monarchs, that obviously had much more intense roles at the local level, in the life of the communities, in the owning of properties and lands, etc. So sometimes there were quite large communitary ecclesiastical bodies that would be installed in these foundations. We're talking sometimes about obviously monks and sometimes of a strongly ascetic, um, you know, um, characterized by a strongly ascetic lifestyle, and all the experiences that followed. So these are the various shades you can think of Christian spirituality of the time. Um, and that often happened, especially the new foundations sometimes were in very impervious and places that were far away from communities. So it was a bit of this original, um, um, especially the first wave of Christian monasticism into Europe that really meant that they had to create, to install these communities in very hostile lands from an environmental point of view that kind of increased the value of the ascetic experience in many ways. And this is a very fascinating environment in my opinion. Um, but we're talking also about communities like um, and depending also on the time, because the Benedictine monks of the 6th century weren't the one of the ninth. Things had dramatically um, changed also in the forms of communitary organizations, etc. So we're talking about clergymen in general. And these communities would be obviously entrusted by the local patrons that had allowed them to install into these new um, monasteries founded by them. It was very appreciated, obviously, and expected that these communities would, through their community experience, um, would obviously pray for the intercession of their patrons in their and their parents patrons, and obviously their descendants, and this was a kind that gave life to traditions that obviously had a very strongly local root, in the sense that it was very important for a noble family of early medieval Europe to have power, to have land, yes, but also to have a community of clergymen that was praying for their own family, for because they genuinely believed that that would have helped them in this world, and not just in the other one, for not in fact just the salvation of their soul, but also for more kind of earthly achievements, because you have to think that the aristocracy, early medieval aristocracy, didn't really understand the practical implications of what it means to pray for. Many people still in the low Middle Ages, some of the most Christian high noblemen, like Jean de Joinville, who wrote this in 13th century, they actually believed that the priests, and that praying, generally speaking, was something in order to that was performed in order to achieve an immediate result. Jean de Joinville says at a certain point, what do I pray for if I don't get victory? What do I pray for for victory for if eventually God doesn't give me victory? And obviously you understand how um, 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 how superficial even the understanding of certain Christian of the Christian doctrine actually was. It was a very contractual mind that a very contractual mindset that was not very dissimilar from the one of the pagan world, and especially in the early Middle Ages, with these first constructions. It could be it could happen quite often that the noble family that had found and instituted the new monastery, etc., for private use, would think that priests praying the Christian God would be helping them to gain very very hurtly and sometimes even trivial um, results in this life. Maybe they were Christians on the surface. Think about the ones who converted in the first generation, then the Franks of Clovis or the Longobards of Agilolf, who yeah, maybe believed in both things. They believed in Christian God, but they were still enough pagan-minded, polytheistic-minded to believe in their own old gods. So it's fascinating to think how progressive even certain changes in in the approach toward Christianity really could make the difference at the time in the way and in organizing um, power and so on. Because if and it was also very highly public thing, because when we think about private foundations, we don't have to think about something that was so extremely detached from the rest of the community, because founding a private monastery or church could you know could happen maybe even very close to a city in many ways, and people would go there because maybe the monastery or the church even had certain relics, and people would go there because that was also another business that private could 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 take substantial revenues from. Um, so we have to think in very pragmatic terms when thinking about this phenomena. Um, and we see indeed that certain monasteries and canonical colleges were born sometimes to become very famous shrines, and that obviously lived to celebrate the piety of the founder's family, and how prestigious they were in the face of God, and so on. So there were also quite, um, they knew how to play their cards, let's say. Um, and we don't have, however, to exclude also the fact that the founders really and genuinely believed that such donations and foundations could grant them salvation in the heavens. So um, we have to think of a society that really kind of took everything that could be useful for those standards. We have to think that these people could be very pragmatic, quite cynic, but at the same time still could have a very strong, very sensible spirituality. Um, and there is really no contradiction into this, because it was society that was meant to work in that way, and even the Christian message was kind of supportive in this sense, because Christianity, realizes quite clearly that in this world things really do not get the way they should. Things go wrong, and there is injustice, etc. But so I can't say that this can commend negative behaviors, because obviously that's not the meaning of Christianity. But in the view of the Christians of those times, this could be seen as, yeah, things go wrong, but hey, it's just on earth. Then if we truly believe about, if we truly believe in God, and we are peers, and we gave donations, etc., we kind of make our own part, and we can achieve salvation in some way. And the so within all these social ambitions, political and social ambitions and economical interests, um, the, there was obviously also a great expansion of the same episcopal power, the bishop power, in the sense that um, part of these foundations at a point could even, pass in the hands of the bishops, could be used to penetrate in certain areas. Think about even the clash of investitures, or all the problems deriving from, the critics were moved to aristocracy for having, overexpanded these private foundations that they used just as political pawns and for making money, etc. So this all these structures became kind of a battleground in this sense, uh, in many ways, and at the same time, European society was increasingly influenced by the expansion of local churches, because it wasn't just about political dependency and personal dependencies that could arrive to happen, because obviously bishops and other clergymen began to with all the revenues that they had to build up lordships on their own, to have political power, military retinues, wage war, and doing essentially the same thing that the lay aristocrats would actually do. But at the same time, there's also the construction of certain local identities that went beyond, these relatively um, practical problems, and had to do really with the beliefs and the convictions of the people of those times. Like think of all the this is a Europe that is still being evangelized, is still being converted to Christianity in many ways. So think about the penetration of rites, of beliefs, and these general, even moral moral admonitions to thinking about the ultimate fate of mankind, and and the community is highly revolved around and were quite intrigued and absorbed by such sometimes even exterior displays of the ecclesiastical power. Think about the even about the great leave aside the relics that obviously were a major attraction that time. They believed to be they were believed to be characterized by magic powers, healing powers, etc., for miracles, etc. But even think about the all the furnitures that these churches had, sometimes quite expensive, uh, you know, um, quite expensive glasses, or other cups, and think about even the clothes of the bishops, etc. In a world this can be seem little for us now, but think about a moment in time in which people were dramatically poor, in which economical growth was something extremely low, in which material culture was extremely miserable, and thinking all these, watching all these, expensive clothing, and even these massive architectural and engineeristic, architectural, think about all the churches and monasteries, how big sometimes they were, and think about what they meant. It wasn't just an aesthetic thing, but it was really a huge display of power, of sheer power, that was even under the eyes of the faithful, and this didn't really happen every once in a while, because the local community was deeply tied to the local you know to the local clergy, and obviously interacted with it quite often. So it was a continuous reminder of how the church was powerful, and how sometimes um, the aristocrats that were behind these private ecclesiastical foundations were powerful and influent, and it even became a matter of pride, because even being a peasant tied to the land, um, in monastic properties, etc., was a source of pride. Yes, the peasant was still probably feeling oppressed and felt the misery of his own life, but there was a kind of pride in being under a monastery, or that was founded by a certain lord that maybe owned other lands around, because it was a kind of local companionism, and these peasants would feel protected by the local lord in this world, and protected in expectation of the other by the local saint that may over whose grave had been built a local monastery by that particular lord. So it was a very intricate relation um, that came to be played in here. Um, and in um, and in general, from the other side, obviously, so from the bishop's side, from the noble side, etc., there was an increasing need of keeping this show going on in many ways. There was a substantial amount of resources that were invested in this display of power and fame. And that's the reason why, from the Middle Ages we have this huge and beautiful ecclesiastical art, Christian art, because really it's not just about obviously the great sensibility of Christianism towards the beauty of life, of the embodiment of Christ, the little child with the Virgin, etc. So this positive view of the world from an anthropological point of view, but it was also a matter of social structures of those times. In the poorer areas of Europe, maybe those in which that were already Christianized, we don't have much of that simply because there weren't resources to sustain that. So always bear in mind in front of this beautiful magnificence of Christian art, also the society and the power and the prestige that the clergy had, and for the reasons that we're talking about. And it's pretty obvious that such great amount of power and prestige implied, as we've seen, resources that had to be put in, but also at the same time a great, an increasing difficulty in controlling and managing all these magnificence. Regarding to private properties, it could happen, for instance, that maybe a Merovingian count would. A Merovingian count would create a foundation for his own family. Then maybe in the 8th or 9th century, that foundation had essentially separated from that family, because maybe the family had died out, and at that point the church could even autonomize itself, and these autonomistic tendencies were sometimes felt even for other reasons, in the sense that think about how many family quarrels there are even today. If your father has placed you as the heir of the fortune, as a lay lord, as a knight, as someone who had to fight um, actively, and your brother as the abbot of your local family monastery, and you quarrel with your brother at a certain point, it might happen that your brother tends to create a sort of lordship on his own from his monastery, if he has enough power, at the point that that monastery, kind of emancipates itself. It's not tied to you anymore, to your family anymore, during the generations, and it grows. It grows as essentially something else, something apart from your family and your property. So at that point, you can understand how, especially for the coercive means of those times, how difficult it was to control many properties, including the ecclesiastical foundations. At the same time, we have to remember that um, ecclesiastical foundations sometimes, especially during the great crisis of feudal owners during the 11th century, with the rise of the cities and the decline of the countryside, where local lords had mostly uh, where the local lords mostly ruled from. Um, Still, donation to churches were still a pretty good strategy, because the churches enjoyed many freedoms, in a way, many immunities, um, and it was a kind of a good investment, probably the best investment that you could do in many ways. It was also a place that was basically sometimes, well, no, this is really not the case, but let's say it was a safer investment than many others, maybe than a ward, than a castle that could quite easily autonomize itself. The monastery kind of remained more loyal sometimes. The ecclesiastical foundation, by its own characters, had a lower potential of infidelity than other structures in many ways. Um, and so what else can we talk about? Um, that regarding, for instance, this last point about the seigneurial rule, we see that from certain notary certain legal documents of those times, that lords would quite easily sell or exchange properties of various kinds, like um, woods, or that were quite remunerative at that time, or mills, or fortresses, or courts, or castles, etc., but also private churches. And what is interesting about this is that private churches and their revenues, their tithes, etc., were kind of sometimes separated from the actual building itself, and the ecclesiastical, maybe the parochial dignity that it had, in the sense that sometimes the tithes of a certain church would be sold separately with the church. What does it mean? That in this total mess that was in seigneurial Europe or feudal Europe, how you want to call it, sometimes you could do something like, now I want to sell, I need money, I need to cash fast, so I maybe buy a tithe, I sell a land of my own, and I buy the tithe of a certain um, church, of a parish, but I don't get to actually rule, to buy the church, to buy the parish as a building, and even its own lands. I just uh, obtain in exchange the tithe, which means that when the local guys there, that can be even somewhere far away, or relatively far away, when those guys cash, that cash goes to me. Now this was done all the time. It might be strange for us, but it was, and that tells you how entrepreneurial it was, really the life of the time in many ways, and how dynamic even the feudal world was regarding to how cleverly it was, and subtly the seigneurial mind would go in order to make deals, to make investments, etc. And this, as I was saying before, produces also legal awareness about the world. It's not just found in a place and saying it's mine. No, it becomes, part of a broader net of communications or relations, etc., that you can use quite fluidly um, for your own interest. So I don't know. I think this was substantially what I wanted to talk about. And there are obviously many other things related to these topics. I think the most beautiful way to understand these topics is really to go read the legal documents of feudal Europe. Especially in those early moments of feudal Europe, in high medieval Europe, in which things are relatively more simple and can be tracked more easily in many ways, even in the early Middle Ages sometimes, and see how dynamic in many ways the policies of those times were, how even simple people with very scarce or non-existent education were capable of, administering their own property and how to, make economical strategies, etc. I think the best thing is really to read those documents and to get into trying to get into their minds, because um, it's very difficult to do. Indeed, it's not something you do. So we don't really um, we can't really pretend to enter in the mind of someone living in the early Middle Ages, but the closest you can get to is definitely from what they wrote, from what they did, from the deals they made, and the sources that document that. So go reading um, go reading early medieval cartoon, cartulae normally were called. These documents, they were usually testaments, but were also, purchasing, documentation and stuff like that that really show brilliantly what I'm talking about. So I stop for now. So I thank you for listening. As always, if you like this video, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel so that you can get further content. So as always, I thank you for your attention. I wish you a beautiful day or night, whenever it is, where you're watching, and see you next time. Bye.